Welcome to Crime Talk, your destination for in-depth true crime investigation and analysis. I'm here to take you beyond the headlines into the evidence, the psychology, and the human stories behind the cases that shock us. Every video on this channel is thoroughly researched, fact-checked, and presented with respect for victims and their families, that we don't glorify violence. We seek to understand it. If you appreciate deep dive investigative content, subscribe to the channel. New cases weekly. Let's dive in. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all charges and is presumed innocent until proven guilty. This video contains discussions of violent crimes and sensitive content. Viewer discretion is advised. All information is based on publicly available sources, including court documents and verified news reports. This content is presented with respect for the victims, their families, and everyone affected by these allegations. For 2 years, Victoria Heuermann defended her father against accusations that would destroy most families, even as prosecutors painted him as one of America's most prolific serial killers, even as forensic scientists linked his DNA to 6 murdered women, even as investigators uncovered a document so methodical, so chilling, that experts called it a blueprint for murder. Victoria stood in that impossible space between love and evidence, between childhood memories and adult horror, between the father she knew and the monster prosecutors described. But denial has limits, and evidence has weight. 1 week before a documentary about her family premiered in June 2025, Victoria Heuermann's psychological dam finally broke. She told producers that based on publicly available facts presented and explained to her, she now believes her father is most likely the Gilgo Beach killer. Most likely. Not definitely. Not certainly. Those 2 words reveal everything about the torture of believing your father is a serial killer. This is the story of Victoria's journey from defender to believer, of how a daughter's loyalty slowly shattered under the weight of inescapable evidence, and of the specific moments, documents, and revelations that made denial impossible. To understand how Victoria's belief system collapsed, you need to understand what her world looked like before July 13th, 2023. Massapequa Park, Long Island, an upper-middle-class suburb where neighbors knew each other and families raised kids in relative safety. The Heuermann family lived in a ramshackle house that stood out in the well-maintained neighborhood, but they were fixtures in the community. Rex Heuermann was a Manhattan architect. Every weekday, he made the commute into the city, working from a midtown office. Victoria worked right alongside him at his architecture consulting firm. Father and daughter, side by side, designing buildings and managing projects. Victoria described being honestly really inspired by her dad. This wasn't a distant or troubled relationship. This was admiration, mentorship, daily collaboration. She saw him at his desk, watched him handle clients, observed his work ethic, his attention to detail, his methodical approach to complex architectural problems. Nothing about him suggested violence. Nothing hinted at a secret life. Her mother, Asa Ellerup, had been married to Rex since 1996. They'd met as teenagers, nearly 3 decades together. 3 decades of birthdays, holidays, ordinary Tuesday evenings, and weekend routines. The family also included Victoria's half-brother, Christopher Sheridan, Asa's son from a previous relationship. Christopher has developmental disabilities, which made the coming trauma even more difficult to process. This was their normal, unremarkable in most ways. The kind of family that blends into suburban America without a second glance. The arrest was quick, professional. Heuermann was taken into custody on charges of murdering 3 women: Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Lynn Costello. Victoria learned about her father's arrest while still at work. The shock must have been seismic. One moment, you're doing normal tasks. The next, everything you understood about your life has been obliterated. But the real horror came that evening. FBI agents came banging on the family's door in Massapequa Park. Multiple vehicles, serious faces, the kind of law enforcement presence that makes neighbors peer through curtains. Victoria, Asa, and Christopher stood in their doorway, and received information that would fracture their reality permanently. They said, "We have evidence your dad murdered all these women and your home is now a crime scene," Victoria remembered. "Never would have imagined I'd be hearing that in my life. Your home is now a crime scene." Those words meant their house, where Victoria grew up, where she had childhood memories, where the family shared meals and celebrated holidays, was now central to a serial murder investigation. The FBI wasn't being dramatic. Authorities believed Heuermann killed his victims in the basement of that house, carefully timing his attacks for when his family was away. That first night, Victoria faced impossible questions. Could her father really have murdered multiple women in their basement while she lived upstairs? How would she not know? Not sense something? Not see any sign? The alternative seemed equally impossible. That police had made a catastrophic mistake. That DNA evidence was wrong. That her father was being framed. Victoria's mother later told the New York Post that Christopher was so distraught and doesn't understand. And as a mother, I have no answers for him. How do you explain to your family that the person they love might be a serial killer? The crimes Rex Heuermann stood accused of were notorious in the region. Between 1993 and 2011, 7 women disappeared. Most were sex workers in their 20s. Their remains were found discarded along Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, a desolate stretch of Long Island coastline. Many bodies were discovered bound with belts or tape and wrapped in burlap. The kills showed planning, control, a predator who knew how to avoid detection. The case had haunted Long Island for over a decade. Multiple bodies discovered in 2010 and 2011 during a search for a missing woman named Shannon Gilbert. Investigators found a mass grave site they hadn't expected. A serial killer became known as the Gilgo Four, initially, for women whose murders seemed clearly connected. But as investigations continued, more victims were linked to the same perpetrator. The body count grew. For years, the killer remained unidentified. Then in July 2023, police arrested the architect from Massapequa Park, and his daughter's world exploded. Victoria had a choice to make: believe the authorities and accept that her father was a monster, or stand by him and maintain that some terrible mistake had been made. For nearly 2 years, she chose a middle path: cautious doubt, uncertainty, the psychologically protective space of "I don't know." But prosecutors weren't finished. They were building a case that would become impossible to deny. Understanding why Victoria eventually believed her father was guilty requires understanding the sheer volume and specificity of evidence prosecutors assembled. This isn't a case built on a single witness or one piece of questionable forensic science. This is a pyramid of proof, each layer reinforcing the others. Let's start with the foundation: DNA. Prosecutors linked Rex Heuermann to 6 of the 7 murdered women through hair evidence. Not just any hair analysis, cutting-edge whole genome sequencing technology that had never been used in a New York courtroom before. Traditional DNA testing looks at 24 to 27 specific locations on your genetic code. Whole genome sequencing examines thousands, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of different variations. It's the difference between checking a few fingerprints versus mapping an entire hand. The technology can extract nuclear DNA from degraded samples, old, rootless, or poor quality hair strands that would be useless with conventional testing. Why does this matter? Because the hair found on these victims had been degraded by time, the elements, and decomposition. Standard DNA testing couldn't generate usable profiles, but whole genome sequencing could. Shortly after Heuermann's arrest, in July 2023, investigators obtained his DNA from a discarded pizza box outside his Manhattan office. Picture this: undercover officers following Heuermann during his lunch break, watching him eat, waiting for him to throw away the box, then recovering it from the garbage. That pizza crust became a crucial comparison sample. Heuermann's DNA, voluntarily discarded, provided prosecutors with a definitive genetic baseline. When forensic scientists compared that DNA to hair samples found on the victims, they found matches. Statistical analysis showed that 99.96% of the North American population could be excluded as the source of certain hairs, but Heuermann could not. 4. Hair found on victim Jessica Taylor. The DNA from a male hair recovered on a surgical drape under her severed body parts with a 99.96% match to Heuermann. But here's where the evidence becomes personally devastating for Victoria. The hairs found on several victims weren't only linked to Rex Heuermann. They were also linked to his wife and daughter through mitochondrial DNA testing. Let me be absolutely clear. Neither Victoria nor her mother are suspected of any involvement in these crimes. Victoria would have been a young child when some of these murders occurred, but their hair was there, on the bodies, on the burlap, on the restraints. Hair found near one victim's wrist was linked to Asa Ellerup and Victoria Heuermann to the exclusion of 99.65% of the North American population. How does a family's hair end up on murder victims? Prosecutors believe these hairs were transferred to victims by Heuermann himself. Microscopic evidence carried from his family life into his alleged crimes. A fiber from Victoria's clothing, a strand from Asa's brush, trace evidence that clings to clothes, gets embedded in car upholstery, sticks to tools or materials. This is called secondary transfer in forensic science. You hug your father. His jacket picks up your hair. Later, he uses that same jacket during crime. Your DNA becomes part of the crime scene without you ever being there. For Victoria, this evidence created an impossible psychological trap. Her own genetic material, something she had no control over, something that identified her as his daughter, was now physical proof linking her father to murder victims. She couldn't dismiss it as mistaken identity. The DNA was real. The connection was real. The question was only, how did it get there? The DNA evidence connected Heuermann to 6 specific victims: Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, Amber Costello, Sandra Costia, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, disappeared in 2007. A belt was recovered from her body with a female human hair on the belt buckle. Amber Costello, last seen in 2010. A female hair was found in the head area. DNA testing indicated it came from Heuermann's wife or daughter. Megan Waterman also disappeared in 2010. Her body was found bound by duct tape. 2 female human hairs were found on her body in the head area. Again, linked to Victoria or her mother. The only victim without DNA evidence connecting to Heuermann was Melissa Barthélemy. But prosecutors had something else for her case. Beyond DNA, prosecutors assembled cell phone data and pings from cell towers pointing to Heuermann's location, placing him in the areas where victims disappeared and where bodies were dumped. They had eyewitness descriptions of him and his distinctive vehicle, a Chevrolet Avalanche truck. Multiple witnesses placing a man matching Heuermann's description with some of the victims before they vanished. The timeline was chilling. Authorities believe Heuermann specifically killed his victims while his wife and children were away, carefully coordinating attacks when his family was out of town. Investigators compared family vacation dates with victim disappearance dates. The correlation was striking. When Asa and the kids left for trips, women started vanishing. This suggested extraordinary premeditation. A man who tracked his family's schedule, who waited for opportunity, who used their absence as hunting time. For Victoria, this pattern answered one question while raising another. It explained how she never saw anything. She literally wasn't there when the crimes occurred. She was on vacation, at summer camp, visiting relatives, living her normal childhood while her father allegedly committed murder. But it also raised a darker question. Did her father wait for her to leave? Did he encourage family trips specifically to create opportunities for murder? The psychological weight of that possibility is crushing. But DNA and cell phone records weren't the most disturbing evidence prosecutors found. That discovery was waiting in the basement, on a hard drive, in a deleted file. And when Victoria learned what was in that document, denial became nearly impossible. In March 2024, 9 months after Rex Heuermann's arrest, forensic investigators made a discovery that would change everything. They were mining through the 58 hard drives recovered from Heuermann's basement. Over 350 electronic devices total had been seized from the house. Computers, external drives, old laptops, decades of digital data. On one hard drive, in what's called unallocated space, the digital graveyard where deleted files go, they found a Microsoft Word document. Someone had tried to erase it. But in the digital world, deletion doesn't mean destruction. Forensic experts brought it back. The file was titled HK 2002-04. The contents were written entirely in capital letters, and what investigators read made them immediately return to the Heuermann house with new search warrants. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney called it a planning document that Heuermann used to methodically blueprint and plan out his kills with excruciating detail. This wasn't a confession. It was something more disturbing, an instruction manual, a checklist, a serial killer's project plan, refined over years of practice. Tierney stated, his intent was specifically to locate these victims, hunt them down to bring them under his control, and to kill them. His intent was nothing short but to murder these victims. The document was organized like any architectural project Rex Heuermann might have worked on professionally. Sections, subsections, tasks broken down into manageable steps, problems identified with solutions proposed. Except this project was murder. The document listed issues to avoid getting caught. At the top of a section titled Problems was a single word, DNA. Even in the early 2000s, when this document was created, Heuermann understood that genetic evidence would be his greatest vulnerability. He was right. DNA would eventually lead to his arrest 2 decades later. Other entries in the Problems section revealed a mind obsessed with operational security. Vid comes on RT-112 to Route 110 equals 33 old. He'd counted surveillance cameras on specific routes. Vid comes on SS PKWI RT-231 to exit 30 equals 10 old. More camera reconnaissance. Hunt too long seen in area too long. A note about being spotted while searching for victims. Remember, don't charge gas. A reminder to pay cash to avoid transaction records. Return for vid comes. In pickup area next time, planning future surveillance checks. Next time, this wasn't hypothetical. This was operational planning with an assumption of repeated acts. The supplies section appeared to be items needed to carry out the serial murders. Heavy rope, drop cloths, hair nets to prevent DNA transfer, cleaning supplies, a police scanner to monitor law enforcement frequencies and avoid active patrols. One specific entry read, use push pins to hang drop cloth from ceiling. When prosecutors read this detail, they knew exactly where to look. They returned to the Heuermann basement with infrared lights and found exactly what the document described. Areas where adhesive had been placed on the paneling and push-pin holes in the drop ceiling. The document wasn't theoretical. It had been implemented. The basement had been modified according to these instructions. Another entry was even more chilling. Use heavy rope for neck. Light rope broke under stress of being tightened. Read that again. Light rope broke under stress. This is past tense. A lesson learned. Evidence of iteration and refinement. A problem encountered during a previous murder, now corrected for future efficiency. This section is where the document transitions from disturbing to nearly unbearable. The body prep checklist included: remove head and hands, remove trace DNA, remove ID marks like tattoos, wash body inside and all cavities, packaging for transport. These aren't the words of someone fantasizing about violence. This is the clinical language of a man who has done this before and wants to do it better next time. The instructions matched precisely with the condition of victims Jessica Taylor and Valerie Mack. Jessica Taylor, who disappeared in 2003, was found with her head removed, arms severed below the elbows, and her tattoo mutilated, exactly as the document prescribed for removing identifying marks. Valerie Mack's remains were similarly dismembered. Incidents occurred indoors, consistent with prosecutors' theory that murders happened in the basement. Noise control equals more playtime. Translation: if he could keep victims quiet, he could prolong the act. The suffering, the control. Another entry read, small is good, under what prosecutors identified as TRG, likely meaning target. It is important to note that the known victims thus far are all petite women, which is consistent with the small is good entry in the document. He had a type, a preference, and he documented it like a project specification. Quoted directly from Douglas's work, "The more you do, the more clues you give." Heuermann was studying the psychology and methodology of serial killers while becoming one. He was learning from FBI analysis of other murderers, then applying those lessons to avoid the mistakes that got them caught. Prosecutors also revealed Heuermann had maintained an extensive collection of violent, bondage, and torture pornography dating back to 1994. The images notably and largely coincide with how the remains of Sandra Costilla, Jessica Taylor, and Valerie Mack were discovered. Fantasy matched reality. Digital consumption matched physical action. For Victoria Heuermann, learning about this document in spring 2024 marked a critical turning point. Because this wasn't something that could be explained away. This wasn't circumstantial. This wasn't a coincidence or bad luck. This was her father's handwriting in the digital realm. His thoughts, his planning, his refinement of technique. And those pushpin holes in the basement ceiling? She'd walked past them her entire childhood, never knowing what they meant. The Peacock documentary, The Gilgo Beach Killer, House of Secrets, captured Victoria Heuermann at her most vulnerable, a daughter trying to reconcile the irreconcilable. Watching her on camera is watching cognitive dissonance in real time. Victoria told filmmakers she was on the fence about her father's guilt. "There's a part of me that thinks he didn't do it, but at the same time, I don't know, he could have just totally had a double life." Notice the construction of that sentence. A part of me thinks he didn't do it, not, I think he didn't do it. She's already fragmenting. Part of her believes one thing. Another part believes something else. The self-divided. "Now that I do look back on my childhood, I do find it very hard to believe my dad actually did all this," she said. Hard to believe. Not impossible. Just hard. The human brain has an extraordinary capacity for denial when confronted with information that threatens our fundamental understanding of reality. It's not weakness. It's a defense mechanism, a psychological airbag that deploys when impact is inevitable. Victoria spent her entire childhood with this man. She was a teenager when some of the alleged murders occurred. She was at school, at after-school activities, on summer vacations, living a normal adolescent life. "That's exactly how I wouldn't know anything," she reasoned. But that explanation, while logical, created new horror. Her absences were his opportunities. Victoria's response reveals her psychological state. "See, if they really did happen down here, he really must have been like Superman for us not to have noticed anything ever." Superman, a figure of impossible abilities. Because that's what it would take for her father to commit these acts in her home without anyone knowing. But then she adds, so for him to do that in this room is a little unrealistic, but not impossible. Not impossible. The wall of denial was cracking. The basement had been Rex's childhood bedroom when he was growing up. It contained some of her father's gun supplies, along with childhood memories and family heirlooms. Imagine standing in a room filled with your father's childhood toys and being told he murdered people there. The cognitive dissonance is almost unbearable. Victoria admitted during filming to feeling some loyalty to her dad. "Listen, whether the world likes it or not, whether I like it or not, he's my dad," she said. "They can't take that away from me." There's defiance in that statement. A daughter protecting what's hers, even if what's hers is a relationship with an accused serial killer. Even with all this growing evidence against him, maybe there's some loyalty still to my dad and to my mom, too. She's aware of the loyalty. She's questioning it, but she can't completely release it. Victoria described what acceptance might look like. If he was guilty, it's going to start to become a love-hate relationship. This is my dad, and I love him as my dad. The hate is this other side of him that came out, and going forward, I'm not going to interact with him the same way I would have if this never happened. Future tense. If he was guilty, still conditional, still leaving room for innocence despite overwhelming evidence. Victoria had visited her father in jail and later told Carrie Rawson, daughter of BTK killer Dennis Rader, "Even when I saw him, when I visited him in jail, he just seemed like himself, how he always is, and it's so hard to even believe the fact that he's this sick killer. He seemed like himself, because he was himself. That's the horror of compartmentalization. Serial killers don't wear masks 24/7. They could be loving fathers and brutal murderers. The human capacity for duality is terrifying. Victoria's struggle was intensified by her mother's absolute refusal to accept Rex's guilt. Throughout the documentary, Asa Ellerup insisted, "No freaking way is this man going out, soliciting sex from sex workers, killing them, and dumping them on Gilgo Beach." Ellerup's attorney later stated, "Even if Rex is found guilty or pleads guilty, I don't know if she'll ever believe that the man she knows was capable of those crimes." Victoria was caught between evidence and family loyalty, between her own evolving belief and her mother's immovable denial. But then came the legal proceedings that would make denial nearly impossible. In March 2025, Suffolk County Court became the battleground for a legal fight that would determine the case's viability. The issue: could prosecutors use the cutting-edge DNA evidence that connected Heuermann to 6 victims? Heuermann's defense attorney Michael Brown called the whole genome sequencing method magic and argued it wasn't trustworthy, reliable, or scientific enough for a courtroom. Brown told the court, "They want to, in essence, have a jury rely on this, which is not trustworthy, it's not reliable, it's not scientific, and it shouldn't be utilized in a court." The defense had a point about novelty. This technology had never been used in a New York State criminal trial. Judge Timothy Motze held what's called a Fry hearing, a proceeding where the judge determines if science is generally accepted as reliable by other experts in the field. The first witness called by prosecutors was Dr. Kelly Harris, an associate professor of genome sciences at the University of Washington. After listing credentials from Harvard to Cambridge, she gave hours of complex testimony validating that genetic sequencing has dramatically advanced with high-precision nuclear DNA, now considered widely accepted science. Harris told the court, "It is embarrassing that a method like this wasn't the state of the art years ago, but better late than never." Dr. Richard Green, founder of the California Laboratory of Forensics that conducted the testing, testified that the technique is widely accepted science. He stated that law enforcement has referred hundreds of cases to his lab to identify human remains, and Suffolk County alone had spent $130,000 on the Gilgo cases. Michael Marciano, director of research for Syracuse University's Forensic and National Security Sciences Institute, explained the process. Rather than look at 24 to 27 areas of the DNA, which is what we typically do in forensic cases, we look at thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of different variations in the DNA. If you think about your DNA, a lot of people see it as a sequence of letters. We're looking for differences in those letters. We share most of our DNA with each other. We're looking for those differences, and those differences can provide information as to the identity of an individual. The science was sound. The methodology was established. The results were reliable. Both sides called a total of 8 witnesses over multiple hearing dates. The courtroom became a graduate-level seminar in forensic genetics. Victoria and her mother attended these hearings, sitting with their attorney, watching as the scientific community validated the evidence against Rex. September 3rd, 2025. Judge Timothy Motze issued his ruling in a 27-page decision. The whole genome sequencing evidence would be admissible at trial. Motze ruled that the use of whole genome sequencing to extract DNA from rootless hairs, create a profile, and compare it to Heuermann is generally accepted in the relevant scientific community. It marked the first time such evidence could be admitted in a New York court and set a new precedent for courts statewide. Suffolk County DA Ray Tierney stated, "The science was on our side, and that's why we won." Obviously, this is another tool in our toolbox, Tierney added. It's not widespread, but this could be one of those critical moments in moving forward in forensic DNA analysis that brings this to the mainstream. The defense immediately challenged on different grounds. Brown filed a new motion citing public health law, arguing the out-of-state laboratory that conducted testing isn't licensed in New York. But the core's scientific validity had been established. Brown said his client was disappointed. "We disagree with the court's decision. Heuermann sat through the hearing under heavy guard and with a new haircut, hearing the judge validate the evidence that connected him to 6 murders. For Victoria, watching this scientific validation play out in real time had profound psychological impact. Her attorney later confirmed her mindset. Being front and center during this process, she has received overwhelming amounts of evidence, just like we all have, that lead to an inescapable conclusion. Inescapable conclusion. The planning document showed premeditation and methodology. The DNA evidence, now court-validated, showed connection. The timeline showed opportunity. The basement modifications showed implementation. Denial was becoming impossible. And then, 1 week before the documentary premiered, Victoria made her decision. June 2025. The Peacock documentary, The Gilgo Beach Killer, House of Secrets, was set to premiere on June 10th. Throughout filming, Victoria had remained on the fence. Conflicted, uncertain, still clinging to the possibility that somehow, despite everything, her father might be innocent. But something shifted in those final days before release. 1 week before the documentary aired, Victoria Heuermann contacted the producers with a statement that would make headlines. The documentary's final episode displays her words on screen. A week before the series release, Victoria Heuermann told the producers that based on publicly available facts that have been presented and explained to her, she now believes her father is most likely the Gilgo Beach killer. Most likely. Not definitely guilty. Not I know he did it. But most likely. Even in acceptance, there's linguistic distance. A daughter leaving the smallest possible room for doubt. Because absolute certainty means absolute loss. The complete death of the father she knew. Victoria's attorney confirmed her evolution. Victoria's feelings and emotions have evolved since July of 2023. We have spent a good amount of time with her explaining the evidence and how it was extracted. Being front and center during this process, she has received overwhelming amounts of evidence that lead to an inescapable conclusion. Inescapable conclusion. Those are the attorney's words. Victoria's own phrasing is more cautious. Most likely. This linguistic difference reveals everything about the torture of this position. Legally, the evidence points one direction. Emotionally, the heart resists. What finally pushed Victoria over the edge? It wasn't one thing. It was accumulation. The planning document showing her father's methodical approach to murder. The DNA evidence validated by the court. The basement modifications matching the document's instructions. The timeline correlating family absences with victim disappearances. Each piece of evidence was a weight. And eventually, the scale tipped. Victoria had tried to hold 2 contradictory beliefs. That her father was the man she knew, and that prosecutors might be right. For nearly 2 years, she lived in that cognitive dissonance. But the human mind can only sustain that tension for so long before something breaks. For Victoria Heuermann, what broke was denial. One conversation may have been pivotal in Victoria's journey. Her discussion with Carrie Rawson. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Carrie Rawson is the daughter of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, one of America's most notorious serial murderers. Dennis Rader terrorized Wichita, Kansas for 3 decades, killing 10 people between 1974 and 1991. He was a church leader, a Boy Scout troop leader, and a compliance officer. He seemed like a model citizen. His daughter, Carrie, had no idea. None. When Dennis Rader was arrested in 2005, Carrie Rawson's world exploded in exactly the same way Victoria's would 18 years later. Carrie has since written a book and become an advocate for families of violent offenders. People trapped in the impossible position of loving someone who committed unspeakable acts. In the documentary, Victoria speaks with Carrie about her experience visiting her father in jail. Even when I saw him, when I visited him in jail, he just seemed like himself, how he always is, and it's so hard to even believe the fact that he's this sick killer, Victoria told Carrie. Carrie understood. She'd lived it. When Dennis Rader was caught, Carrie went through the same psychological warfare, the same denial, the same desperate hope that maybe, somehow, it was all a mistake. But eventually, Carrie accepted the truth. Her father was BTK. The loving dad who attended her school events was also a sadistic killer who taunted police and terrorized families. That acceptance didn't come quickly. It didn't come easily. And it didn't mean she stopped loving him. It just meant she learned to love him while knowing what he was. Carrie's journey likely gave Victoria a roadmap, proof that you can survive the psychological devastation of discovering your parent is a monster, that you can integrate that knowledge without completely losing yourself. Victoria needed to know she wasn't alone, that other daughters had walked this path and found a way forward. But understanding you can survive isn't the same as wanting to accept the truth. While Victoria was evolving toward acceptance, her mother remained in absolute denial. Asa Ellerup's position never wavered throughout the documentary or after. No freaking way is this man going out, soliciting sex from sex workers, killing them and dumping them on Gilgo Beach, Asa insisted. Her attorney put it bluntly. Even if Rex is found guilty or pleads guilty, I don't know if she'll ever believe that the man she knows was capable of those crimes. Time will only tell whether Asa will ever accept the truth. This created a fracture in the family. Victoria moving toward belief. Asa remaining in denial. Both women traumatized, but processing that trauma in completely different ways. The family had already been legally fractured. Only days after Heuermann's arrest in July 2023, Asa filed for divorce. The split was finalized in March 2025, but Victoria clarified the separation wasn't about abandoning Rex. It was practical. Financial protection. The family needed to shield assets from potential civil lawsuits and legal fees that could bankrupt them. The documentary captured the family speaking to Heuermann by phone from jail. They continued attending court hearings together with their attorney. The connection hadn't been severed, just legally restructured. Victoria's half-brother Christopher struggled to comprehend what was happening. His developmental disabilities made processing the situation even more difficult. He was so distraught and doesn't understand, Asa said. The family participated in the Peacock documentary, produced by rapper 50 Cent's G-Unit Film and Television Production Company. An NBC Universal spokesperson confirmed the family was compensated but declined to specify the amount. Critically, payments could not go toward Heuermann or his defense funds. The money was for Asa, Victoria, and Christopher, victims in their own right of Rex's alleged crimes. The family also made plans to escape the nightmare house in Massapequa Park. They intended to sell the property and move to South Carolina, where they owned other real estate. Imagine trying to sell a house where prosecutors allege 7 women were murdered. Imagine potential buyers asking for a tour of the basement. The stigma alone would crater the property value. But staying was impossible. That house held too many ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. Some criticized the family for participating, for profiting from tragedy. But what choice did they have? Legal fees were mounting. The house was unsellable at fair value. Their lives had been destroyed through no fault of their own. The documentary gave them agency, a chance to tell their side, to show the world they were victims too. And for Victoria, it became a chronicle of her psychological evolution from defender to believer. The DNA and planning document were the headline evidence, but prosecutors built a case with multiple supporting pillars. Heuermann allegedly kept newspaper and magazine clippings about the Gilgo Beach serial killings in his Massapequa Park home. He'd been following his own case for years, tracking media coverage, seeing what investigators knew and didn't know. This is common among serial killers, the desire to relive their crimes, to bask in the attention, to feel superior to the investigators hunting them. Prosecutors had burner phone data, cell phones purchased with cash, used briefly, then discarded. The pattern suggested someone trying to avoid detection. The location data from these phones placed Heuermann in areas where victims disappeared. They had internet search history. Heuermann's computers showed searches related to the investigation, to specific victims, to the Gilgo Beach case itself. The pornography collection was extensive and specific. Prosecutors noted that the violent, bondage, and torture images Heuermann collected dating back to 1994 notably and largely coincide with how the remains of several victims were discovered. Fantasy and reality blurred. The images he consumed matched the violence he allegedly inflicted. There were witness descriptions. People who saw a large man matching Heuermann's distinctive appearance with some of the victims before they vanished. People who noticed his Chevrolet Avalanche truck, an unusual vehicle that stood out in witness memories. The methodical nature of the crimes matched Heuermann's professional profile. He was an architect, trained to plan complex projects with extreme attention to detail. The planning document read like a construction blueprint, just for murder instead of buildings. Prosecutors also highlighted that Heuermann allegedly used victims' cell phones to taunt their families after killing them, calling grieving relatives, letting them hear breathing on the line. Psychological torture extending beyond the physical murders. For Melissa Barthelomy's case, where DNA evidence was lacking, prosecutors believe Heuermann used her phone to torment her family on multiple occasions. The evidence wasn't just scientific. It was behavioral, circumstantial, digital, physical, testimonial. Every angle pointed to the same conclusion, and Victoria saw all of it. Piece by piece, month by month, the prosecution building its case while she tried to maintain belief in her father's innocence. Eventually, the weight became unbearable. Amid the focus on Victoria's journey and the evidence against Rex Heuermann, 7 women lost their lives. They deserve to be remembered as people, not just case files. Melissa Barthelomy, 24 years old, disappeared in 2009. She was working as an escort in New York City, trying to make a living in difficult circumstances. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 25, vanished in 2007. She had a life, dreams, people who loved her. Megan Waterman, 22, disappeared in 2010. She was bound with duct tape and left like refuse along a desolate highway. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, last seen in 2010. Her remains were found with the others, part of the Gilgo Four, whose discovery broke the case open. These 4 women were found together in 2010, triggering the massive investigation that would eventually lead to Rex Heuermann 13 years later. But there were others. Sandra Costia, 28, killed in 1993. Her murder predated the others by years, suggesting Heuermann, if guilty, had been killing for nearly 3 decades. Jessica Taylor, 20, disappeared in 2003 while working as an escort in Manhattan. Her remains were found in 2 locations, her body mutilated exactly as the planning document prescribed. Her tattoo had been destroyed in what prosecutors believe was an attempt to prevent identification. Valerie Mack, who disappeared in 2000. Her partial remains were found in Manorville, with more discovered later along Ocean Parkway. Like Jessica Taylor, she'd been dismembered. These women were daughters too. Sisters. Friends. Human beings with lives that mattered. The investigation into their deaths was hampered for years by corruption in Suffolk County law enforcement. Critics argue that if police had acted more competently earlier, some of these women might still be alive. The case became a symbol of how society fails sex workers, how their murders aren't investigated with the same urgency as other victims, how they're dismissed as high risk rather than treated as human beings deserving justice. Rex Heuermann, if guilty, chose vulnerable victims specifically because he thought society wouldn't care enough to catch him. For 20 years, he was right. But DNA technology eventually evolved beyond his planning. Science caught up to his methodology. And in July 2023, the architect for Massapequa Park was finally arrested. Rex Heuermann has pleaded not guilty to all 7 murders. He remains in Suffolk County Jail with no trial date yet scheduled. His next court appearance is set for September 23, 2025, where judges will continue hearing defense motions and procedural matters. The defense continues fighting on multiple fronts. After losing the battle over DNA admissibility, they filed new motions challenging the out-of-state laboratory's licensing in New York. They're also pushing for separate trial for the 7 murders, arguing that trying all cases together would create unfair prejudice. The cumulative effect of 7 murder charges in one trial could make it impossible for Heuermann to receive a fair hearing. Prosecutors argue separation is inappropriate because the victims are inextricably interwoven by geographic proximity, victimology, digital and physical evidence, forensic analysis, and defendant's own planning document. The planning document becomes key to the prosecution's argument. It allegedly covers methodology used across all 7 murders, suggesting a single criminal enterprise rather than separate acts. Suffolk County District Attorney Ray Tierney has indicated they're seeking one trial to save time and taxpayer money. More importantly, they believe the pattern evidence is crucial, showing that these weren't random acts but a sustained campaign of serial murder. The DNA ruling in September 2025 was a major victory for prosecutors. Judge Motzi's decision to allow whole genome sequencing evidence sets precedent that will affect cold cases across New York State. Other investigators are already looking at their unsolved murders, wondering if this technology can finally bring closure to decades-old cases. For Victoria Heuermann, the legal proceedings continue. Each hearing brings new revelations. Each motion exposes more evidence. Each court date is a reminder that her father stands accused of being one of the most prolific serial killers in New York history. And with each piece of evidence, her statement becomes more certain. He most likely did it. Victoria Heuermann's journey from denial to belief raises profound questions about human psychology and the nature of family bonds. How do you reconcile loving someone with knowing they may have committed unspeakable acts? Dr. Catherine Ramsland, a forensic psychology professor who has studied families of serial killers extensively, describes it as a kind of psychological warfare. The mind literally splits into competing factions. One part holds your lived experience, years of memories, moments of genuine love and connection, the relationship you believed was real. The other part confronts the evidence, DNA results, planning documents, victim testimony, the mounting proof that challenges everything you thought you knew. These two realities cannot coexist comfortably. Something has to give. For some family members, like Asa Ellerup, the solution is absolute denial. Reject the evidence entirely. Maintain that prosecutors, scientists, and investigators are all wrong. Hold on to the person you knew, regardless of what the outside world says. This isn't stupidity. It's psychological survival. Accepting that your spouse of 3 decades is a serial killer means accepting that your entire adult life was built on a lie, that you slept next to a murderer, that you raised children in a house where women were tortured and killed. The cognitive devastation of that acceptance can be psychologically fatal. Some minds simply refuse to go there. For others, like Victoria, the solution is gradual acceptance with conditions. Most likely guilty allows for the smallest sliver of doubt, a psychological escape hatch that keeps complete despair at bay. Victoria's evolution took nearly 2 years. From the shock of her father's arrest to her final statement in June 2025, she moved through classic stages of grief and trauma. First, denial and shock. This can't be real. There must be a mistake. Second, bargaining and rationalization. Maybe the evidence is wrong. Maybe there's an explanation. Third, depression and acceptance. The weight of proof becomes undeniable. The truth settles in, however unwanted. But acceptance doesn't mean the end of love. And that's perhaps the most psychologically complex aspect of this situation. Victoria can believe her father is most likely guilty while still loving the man who raised her. These feelings aren't mutually exclusive. They're the reality of being a serial killer's child. She described it perfectly. This is my dad and I love him as my dad. The hate is this other side of him that came out. 2 people, 1 body, the father she knew and the killer he allegedly was. Compartmentalization isn't just something serial killers do. It's what their families must learn to survive. Victoria Heuermann now joins a small, tragic club, Children of Notorious Serial Killers. Carrie Rawson, daughter of BTK killer Dennis Rader, has been public about her journey. She's written books, given interviews, tried to help others in similar situations. Melissa Moore is the daughter of Keith Hunter Jesperson, the happy face killer, who murdered at least 8 women in the 1990s. She's become an advocate and author, speaking openly about the trauma of discovering your parent is a monster. These women share common experiences: the initial disbelief, the gradual accumulation of evidence, the moment when denial becomes impossible, the grief for the parent you thought you had, the anger at being deceived, the guilt that somehow you should have known, and perhaps worst of all, the public scrutiny. Victoria Heuermann can't go anywhere without being recognized now. Her face has been on national news. Her father's case is one of the most high-profile serial killer investigations in recent American history. People will stare. They'll whisper. They'll wonder, did she really not know? Could she have stopped it? Is she somehow complicit? The answer to all these questions is no. Victoria was a victim of her father's alleged crimes too. Not in the same way as the women who lost their lives, but a victim nonetheless. She lost her father. She lost her childhood home. She lost her sense of safety and understanding of reality. She lost the ability to trust her own perceptions. If your father could be a serial killer without you knowing, what else might you be blind to? What other horrors might lurk beneath the surface of normal life? This hypervigilance, this loss of basic trust in reality, is a form of trauma that will likely affect Victoria for the rest of her life. She'll need therapy, years of it, processing not just what her father allegedly did, but what it means about her life, her identity, her ability to trust and connect with others. Future relationships will be complicated. How do you date when you're the daughter of an accused serial killer? How do you explain that to potential partners? How do you trust your own judgment about people when you were so wrong about the person closest to you? Career prospects become difficult. Victoria worked with her father in his architecture firm. That career path is now tainted by association. She'll need to rebuild professionally, likely in a different field entirely. The family name Heuermann is now synonymous with serial murder on Long Island. She may consider changing it, trying to create distance from her father's alleged crimes. But you can't outrun this kind of notoriety. The internet never forgets. Her connection to this case will follow her forever. Victoria will also have to navigate her relationship with her father going forward. Will she visit him in prison? Some children of serial killers maintain contact, trying to separate the person from the crimes. Others cut off all communication, unable to reconcile their love with the horror. If Heuermann is convicted, Victoria faces decades of potential prison visits, phone calls, decisions about whether to maintain a relationship with a man serving life sentences for multiple murders. There's no right answer, no guidebook for how to be the daughter of a serial killer. She'll have to figure out day by day, decision by decision, balancing her own needs against whatever feelings remain for the man who raised her. The Rex Heuermann case is terrifying not just because of what he allegedly did, but because of how long he allegedly did it while living a completely normal life. If the prosecution is correct, Heuermann murdered 7 women over 3 decades while maintaining a career, a marriage, raising children, commuting to Manhattan daily, attending family events, and appearing utterly ordinary. This challenges our fundamental assumptions about what serial killers look like. We want to believe we could spot them, that there would be warning signs, red flags, indicators of the monster beneath the mask. But the reality is more disturbing. Many serial killers are exceptionally good at appearing normal. They have families who love them, colleagues who respect them, neighbors who wave to them. Dennis Rader was a church leader and compliance officer. John Wayne Gacy was a Democratic Party activist who dressed as a clown for children's parties. Ted Bundy was charming and educated, volunteering at a suicide crisis hotline. The mask isn't a disguise they wear reluctantly. It's an integral part of who they are. They can genuinely love their families while also torturing and killing victims. These aren't separate people with split personalities. They're the same person with compartmentalized behaviors. Rex Heuermann could help Victoria with homework on Monday, murder a woman on Tuesday while the family was away, then return to normal family life on Wednesday. The compartmentalization is nearly perfect. This is what makes them so successful at avoiding detection. Their families provide cover, normalization, camouflage. No one suspects the family man, the devoted father, the hardworking architect. Victoria and Asa weren't just victims of Heuermann's alleged crimes. They were, unknowingly, part of his cover. Their existence made him seem safe, normal, beyond suspicion. That's a crushing realization for Victoria. Not only was she deceived, but her presence in his life may have enabled him to continue killing. If he'd been a loner, authorities might have suspected him sooner. But a man with a wife and kids, who commutes to work daily, who lives in suburban Massapequa Park, that profile doesn't match the stereotype of a serial killer. And stereotypes, however inaccurate, influence investigations. The Gilgo Beach case also reveals how much technology has evolved. In the 1990s and early 2000s, when most of these murders allegedly occurred, DNA testing was far more limited. Heuermann's planning document shows he understood DNA was a risk, but the technology available at the time couldn't extract useful profiles from degraded, rootless hairs. He planned around the limitations of 1990s forensic science. But science advanced. Whole genome sequencing became possible. What was once untestable became testable. And the hair samples that had been sitting in evidence for decades suddenly became the key to his arrest. This should terrify every serial killer still at large. The evidence that couldn't convict you 20 years ago might be retested with new technology. The cold case you think you escaped might be reopened. For investigators, it's hopeful. Families of victims in decades-old unsolved murders now have new possibilities for justice. The technology that caught Rex Heuermann will catch others. When Rex Heuermann eventually goes to trial, it will be one of the most closely watched proceedings in recent New York history. The evidence is substantial. The DNA linking him to 6 victims. The planning document showing methodology and premeditation. The timeline correlating family absences with murders. The witness descriptions. The burner phone data. But defense attorneys will fight every piece. They'll challenge the DNA technology, argue the planning document could be fantasy rather than reality, question witness reliability, and create reasonable doubt wherever possible. That's their job. Everyone deserves a vigorous defense, even those accused of horrific crimes. The trial could last months, potentially longer if there are multiple trials for the different murders. Victoria will have to decide whether to attend, whether to watch prosecutors present evidence of her father's alleged crimes in granular detail, whether to hear victim impact statements from the families of the women he's accused of killing. Some children of accused killers attend trials. Others can't bear it. There's no right choice. If Heuermann is convicted, he'll likely receive multiple life sentences. At 61 years old, he would die in prison. For Victoria, that conviction would provide a kind of closure. Legal validation that her belief was correct, that the evidence was overwhelming, that accepting his guilt was the right choice. But it would also mean the final death of the father she thought she knew. Hope, however irrational, would be extinguished completely. If somehow Heuermann is acquitted, an unlikely scenario given the evidence, but possible, Victoria faces different psychological torture. Was she wrong to believe he was guilty? Would that vindicate her mother's denial? The trial outcome will shape Victoria's psychological future regardless of the verdict. Victoria Heuermann's journey from defending her father to believing he's most likely the Gilgo Beach killer is a story about the limits of denial and the weight of evidence. For 2 years, she tried to hold 2 incompatible realities in her mind. The father she knew and loved. The serial killer prosecutors described. The planning document broke through her defenses. The DNA evidence validated by the court removed scientific doubt. The basement modifications showed implementation of written plans. The accumulation became unbearable. Her final statement, most likely guilty, reflects the psychological complexity of her position. She's accepted the overwhelming probability while leaving the smallest possible room for doubt. Because absolute certainty means absolute loss. Victoria now faces a future as the daughter of an accused serial killer. That identity will follow her forever. Every job interview, every new relationship, every attempt to build a normal life will be shadowed by her father's alleged crimes. But she's not alone. Other children of serial killers have walked this path. They've found ways to survive, to build lives, to integrate the horror without being destroyed by it. Victoria will need time, therapy, support, distance from the media circus. She'll need to grieve the father she thought she had, while potentially visiting the father who actually exists. She'll need to reconcile her love for him with her belief in his guilt. This isn't a journey with a clear endpoint. It's a lifelong process of integration and acceptance. For the families of the 7 victims, Victoria's statement of belief might provide small comfort. The daughter believed the evidence. Even family loyalty has limits when confronted with overwhelming proof. But their loved ones are still gone. Melissa, Maureen, Megan, Amber, Sandra, Jessica, and Valerie. 7 women whose lives were stolen. 7 families forever shattered. The Gilgo Beach case reminds us that monsters don't always look like monsters. They look like us. They live among us. They can be fathers, husbands, professionals, neighbors. And their families suffer twice. First from the deception, then from the revelation. Victoria Heuermann's courage in confronting the truth, in evolving from denial to belief despite the personal cost, deserves recognition. She could have retreated into absolute denial like her mother. She could have refused to engage with evidence. She could have maintained her father's innocence regardless of proof. Instead, she looked at the evidence and accepted the inescapable conclusion. Her father is most likely the Gilgo Beach killer. Those words cost her everything. Her sense of reality, her childhood memories, her relationship with her father, her normal life. But they honor the truth. And in a case built on decades of lies and hidden horror, truth matters. The trial will continue. Evidence will be presented. A jury will decide Rex Heuermann's fate. But for Victoria, the most important verdict has already been reached. She knows what her father most likely is. And she'll spend the rest of her life learning to live with that knowledge. The whole genome sequencing technology that broke this case open is revolutionizing forensic science. This case also raises profound questions about how we identify and stop serial killers before they accumulate victims over decades. The warning signs that were missed. The investigative failures that let Heuermann allegedly kill for 30 years. I'll be covering that in an upcoming deep dive. What's your take on Victoria's journey? Could you maintain belief in a loved one's innocence against this kind of evidence? How do you process the idea that your own family member could be capable of such horror? The psychology here is as fascinating as it is heartbreaking. Share your thoughts respectfully in the comments below. For those interested in the families of serial killers and how they cope, Carrie Rawson's book, A Serial Killer's Daughter, provides incredible insight into this experience. It's worth reading to understand the other victims of serial murder, the families left behind. This case is still developing. The trial hasn't begun. New evidence may emerge. Legal motions will continue. I'll be following every development and creating updates as this story unfolds. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in the Gilgo Beach case. Hit that notification bell because when there's a major development, whether it's a trial date, new evidence, or a verdict, you'll want to know immediately. If you found this deep dive valuable, the like button helps more people discover this kind of thorough true crime investigation. The algorithm rewards engagement, and your like tells YouTube this content matters. Thank you for watching this difficult story with me. True crime isn't just about the crimes themselves. It's about the human beings affected, the victims who lost their lives, the families trying to find justice, and yes, even the families of the accused trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Victoria Heuermann's story reminds us that behind every headline are real people facing unimaginable choices. She chose truth over comfort, evidence over denial, reality over the fantasy of innocence. That choice cost her everything, but it honored the 7 women who lost their lives. And in the end, that's what justice requires. Truth, however painful. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.